Hello, how are you today? Anyway, we're on lesson 81 and lesson 82, the voyages of Zheng He and the Forbidden City of the Ming. Have you guys heard about that before? I know. Guess what? I hadn't heard much about this subject, so it was very intriguing for me. So to start off, I'm going to ask you some questions. First, do you ever like to show off? Hmm? Maybe something you made, maybe a grade you got, maybe some new clothes, maybe a trophy you earned. Maybe you want to show off your room after you cleaned it up. Yeah, those actually are good things. And yes, we like to make people, others seem proud of us, or maybe envious of us, or maybe even jealous of us. Just something in our nature. God made that for good, to give Him the glory. But sometimes we like to make ourselves get the glory instead of God. That's kind of our nature. Today we'll be talking about another king, and his name Yongle. Yongle, which means perpetual happiness, because he was Lord of all. It's kind of into himself, huh? But Yongle's name, his real name was Zhu Dai, and he was from what was called the Ming Dynasty in China. And he wanted to demonstrate his great power to all the nations around him and to be recognized as Lord of all heaven. He wanted all nations to bow down to him as Lord and pay tribute. He was a real show-off, I'd say, huh? Yeah? Although he had a very hard time doing this because he lived in a city that was a forbidden city, that no foreigners were allowed to come in to the city that was built there. So he had to think other ways of showing off. Well, let's go back in time a little bit. Let's go back in time to Marco Polo and his journeys. Remember his journeys to China? Do you remember Kublai Khan? The great Khan wanted the Europeans to come to his country, and he tried to make the Silk Road safe, and he actually put his guards there, and he also built these great big palace places, in the time of that the Mongols controlled China. But after Kublai Khan's death, traveling the Silk Road became more and more difficult. The Mongol leaders divided up the land and they fought with each other. And the merchants traveled less and less to China, and sometimes hardly at all anymore, because they're feared being killed on the road. Meanwhile, some new rulers took over in China, the emperors of the Ming. And they took over the lands of Kublai Khan because there was no real strong Mongol leaders anymore. And so the Ming came in, and the Ming dynasty improved the cities, and they built up the palaces more. And Yongle, he was the third generation of the Ming, and he built a palace at Beijing that was magnificent, this magnificent palace. Yongle was the show-off, yes he was, and he thought his name being perpetual joy forever that would bring joy. But the Mings built this, the Ming dynasty built this forbidden city, and he was forbidden actually to even leave the city. And no foreigner was allowed in it. The palace was as large as a city. The construction of it started in 1421, and it took 14 years to build. It was made out of enormous stones cut from stone quarries outside of Beijing. The stones were too heavy for the oxen to pull them, so what they would do, they'd wait till winter, and then they would dig these wells, and they'd flood like 300 and 400 foot water pieces at one time, and then they'd wait till it froze, and they would actually drag an oxen to pull and to drag and to slide these huge, huge stones on the ice. So the stones were so big, they were like 30-foot high stones. Can you imagine them sliding them, pushing them along the ice? Well, inside, After building this huge palace, it's not was a palace, it was more of a city. There was 9,999 smaller buildings. And a lot of the stones were built with this red brick that was made of rice and lime and smashed together with a cement that was made of rice and egg whites. It made it very, very strong and stayed strong for centuries. And then they would color a lot of things yellow because yellow meant royalty in China. And they would paint with gold dragons and these huge yellow paintings of gold dragons all over the palaces and a lot of different symbols that were on the palace's wall. Each building had a special name. There was the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Middle Harmony, and the Hall of Preserving Harmony. Then there was the Hall of Military Might. There was the Hall of Peace, and there was the Hall of Tranquility. There was in the Emperor's Hall, the Hall of Celestial Purity. And all of the walls were lacquered in this red, and the marble floors, the marble covered all the floors. And they were actually gold all over, gold carvings of mainly dragons and lots of different things. Dragons in where the Emperor's hall was. You can look at the photos there in your book. They had lots of symbols. The North Star, the purple star, they were considered themselves the center of heaven. China was considered the middle kingdom of the world. And the purple palace there was holy, and no one could enter except the emperor was with them or without the emperor's permission. The buildings were aligned just perfectly. It was called the art of placement, or the art of placing things, called Feng Shui. And this would be the proper placement that would balance and harmonize out and give people positive attitudes while they were there. They would face south because south was a lot happier than facing the cold north. And the ornaments and the numbers on the doors and the figures all had meaning. They put a black roof on the library to protect the library from fires, they would say. And to their defense, to protect the emperor from their enemies, they had a moat that went around, 175 feet wide, 30-foot tall moat. The door there was 28 inches or 28 feet thick and 21 feet thick at the top, and it would slant. It was such a thick door they couldn't knock it down. It was like such a barricade there. Also, they had many cauldrons of water sitting all over the place in case of fires. They had lookout towers in all the corners of each wall, and golden bricks, and paved the halls around there. They had these huge, beautiful wood planks that were made out of the Phoebe Zenon trees, which were native only to China then. It was magnificent. Such a large, magnificent complex. It took 100,000 skilled craftsmen to build it, and 1 million workers in 1407 to 1421. The emperor's family, a child grew up inside and never was allowed to leave. The child could do painting lessons. They could do their education, school lessons. They could fly kites. They could go ice skating. They had pet birds. They could see plays and concerts. They'd go to this place called the Pavilion of the Cheerful Melodies, and they'd hear people sing. And their most fun, one of their favorite things to do, would be raising crickets. Raising crickets, can you imagine that? They would take their crickets for walks on leashes with a thread on the leash. And they'd have cricket fights. And you can still, even now, you can still see some of these cricket cages in museums of China when the kids played with their pet crickets. Quite a deal, huh? Well, Yongle, even though the foreigners were kept from coming into the forbidden city, Yongle wanted to know about the rest of the world. So he thought maybe he could build ships. Maybe he could bring these ships out and pay Chinese explorers to show off their wealth, to go on expeditions to distant lands and to bring back news, to bring back souvenirs to him. things that he didn't have, maybe.